Well, hello and welcome to Critical Weight Theory. So, in this episode, I'm exploring one of the most influential books in modern feminist philosophy, The Second Sex by Simone de Beauvoir. Even if you've never read it in its entirety, and I must admit I haven't read it entirely, but you've most certainly encountered ideas that trace back to this remarkable work. One of her most famous observations is deceptively simple. Quote, one is not born, but rather becomes a woman. So that sentence changed the way many scholars think about gender. It suggests that while biological differences certainly exist, the social meaning attached to those differences is not inevitable. Instead, it is learned, reinforced, and reproduced throughout culture. At the heart of de Beauvoir's philosophy is the concept of otherness. According to her analysis, men have historically occupied the position of the default human being. Man represents the universal, the standard against which everything else is measured. Woman, by contrast, is defined in relation to man. Rather than being understood as an autonomous subject, she becomes the other and ultimately an object. And this isn't simply a matter of language or description, it's a relationship of power. When one group is treated as the norm, everyone else becomes the exception. The hierarchy becomes invisible sometimes because it simply appears natural, because it is presented as the natural state of things. De Beauvoir argues that this framework shapes virtually every aspect of society. So, why is that? Well, socially, politically, economically, and culturally, women's experiences have often been treated as secondary or omitted entirely from what counts as universal human history. Even language hints at this tradition sometimes. A lot of vocabulary reflects centuries of assuming that the male experience represents humanity itself. And this leads us to one of de Beauvoir's key insights. Many differences we casually describe as natural are actually social constructions layered on top of some biological realities. So, biology exists, and culture interprets biology, and those interpretations carry enormous consequences. Physical differences between men and women are frequently assigned meanings that go far beyond anatomy. Strength, emotion, leadership, caregiving, competitiveness, and countless other traits become linked to biological sex, even when those connections are historically and culturally contingent. Those interpretations can then be used to justify unequal social roles. In other words, whether biology or social conditions matter more depends on the specific questions being asked. Sometimes biology plays the larger role, sometimes social structures do, and often they interact to complicate things. And that distinction is important because it avoids reducing every difference to either biology or culture alone. So instead, it asks us to investigate evidence rather than assume conclusions. Biology has frequently been interpreted through what we can accurately call a patriarchal system, a social order or patriarchal system. I pronounced it kind of funny, but it's a social order in which masculine characteristics receive greater value and authority. So, women's reproductive roles, physical differences, or emotional stereotypes are transformed into arguments for political, economic, or intellectual subordination. So, for example, there are many arguments from right wingers out there that because women are overly emotional, they cannot be equally as good as leaders, which is crazy in this day and age because we have seen people like Donald Trump, who is constantly emotionally triggered by seemingly everything. Like he just cannot avoid being emotionally triggered. So the current day, this situation we are in, thoroughly debunks that idea, yet it still persists because the culture still hammers that value into people's heads, that superstition, that stereotype into people's heads that women just cannot be trusted because of their emotions. That's repeated just constantly and constantly. And the differences themselves aren't necessarily the main issue. The meanings attached to them are. This process of othering extends well beyond individual interactions. Institutions, including families, schools, religious organizations, governments, workplaces, and media, help reproduce expectations about masculinity and femininity. So there are differences you can say between people, especially on an individual level, but also, on a broader scale, on a larger scale. But nevertheless, it is the task of patriarchal institutions to exaggerate these differences and sometimes create new ones out of thin air if necessary, to preserve the concept that men must simply dominate. And children learn these expectations early. Boys hear phrases like boys will be boys. Girls often receive different messages about appearances, behavior, ambition, and acceptable emotional expression. And of course, men learn to hide their emotions in a lot of cases too. And over time, these expectations begin to feel normal, even inevitable. And what appears to be the natural order may actually be a carefully maintained social arrangement. And this perspective also challenges the familiar idea that men and women are simply different but equal. The language of complementarity can sound balanced on the surface, yet feminist scholars often ask a deeper question. If the roles really are equal, why are the traits associated with men so frequently rewarded with greater authority, prestige, income, and political influence? Well, the issue is not merely difference, it's valuation. Who gets recognized, whose work is celebrated, in some cases whose work gets better compensated with money and resources, whose experiences become the default. These questions continue to shape debates over representation in politics, business, science, literature, and history, as well as just families. And critics sometimes respond by pointing to famous women throughout history. And certainly, many remarkable women have been recognized and celebrated. So, that is actually true. But feminist historians argue that these isolated examples do not erase broader historical patterns. The question is not whether individual women succeeded, it's whether women's contributions have consistently received the same visibility, preservation, and institutional recognition as men's. So, this is a little bit of an anecdote, but I know somebody who was involved in science, like she was involved in some field relating to chemistry, and she gave me some tales of how she was often expected to be like the coffee girl, and that was a sexist idea, and it was in many ways degrading, of course, because it just naturally assumed that women had to be subordinate to men and bring them coffee. So that's one example. For example, in recent decades, feminist scholarship has expanded significantly beyond de Beauvoir's original framework. Perhaps the most influential development is what is called intersectionality. Scholars like Bell Hooks and Kimberly Crenshaw argue that there's no single universal female experience because race, class, sexuality, disability, nationality, and other identities shape how individuals experience power and discrimination. A wealthy white woman and a poor black woman may both encounter sexism, but they do not necessarily encounter the exact same forms of inequality in the exact same way. And another major development came from philosopher Judith Butler. In Gender Trouble, Butler pushed beyond de Beauvoir's existentialism by arguing that gender is not simply something society teaches us. Instead, gender itself is continually performed through repeated behaviors, language, institutions, and social expectations. So that was an emphasis on just the way in which people fall into habits, basically, by performing rituals rather than having it always be a sort of formal lesson, which is sort of an important distinction. It sounds like it's not that big of a difference, but it kind of is. So rather than expressing some authentic inner identity, gender may actually be produced through performance, and that's why in many cases people end up not being themselves or not feeling like themselves. And this is something that doesn't only impact women. For example, if you are a man who's interested in, I don't know, maybe being a ballet dancer or something like that, well, obviously some people out there are going to scoff at that idea. If you are interested in the arts or something like that, um, a hyper masculine man will tear that apart. Like the stereotypical macho tough guy would probably look down on some guy who wants to be a dancer. And, they of course would assume that he's not heterosexual, even though, I mean, presumably you could be a male dancer and be a straight guy. You know, that's just one example, of how this can actually work both ways. And of course, another example is if a guy wants to wear makeup or something like that. People will have all sorts of assumptions about that, even though it might just be an interest in just the pure cosmetics of it, the look of it. It might not even have much of a broader significance. It might just be the way a person wants to present themselves to the public. But there will be all sorts of assumptions that people might make about it, and it's a tendency that some people might have of making a bigger deal out of something than it needs to be. And I guess really the basic solution to some of this stuff is just for people to sort of mind their own business and try to be themselves. Of course, that's not the complete antidote or whatever to the problems that I'm highlighting here, but it's a partial solution. So, post colonial feminists, I mean, they further broadened this discussion by examining how colonial history intersects with patriarchy. And for many women in formerly colonized societies, gender oppression cannot be easily separated from race, imperialism, economics, and global power structures. Meanwhile, it's another challenge to examine this through just the general critiques of power structures, because it's easy to see this feminist stuff sometimes as possibly a distraction from other questions, but in reality, the ability to question gender roles actually goes hand in hand with questioning the global power structures. If if these institutions benefit from creating artificial differences between people, then I would say it pays to put them under a microscope. I personally like the idea of people just being themselves, and just letting themselves shine through. So, anyway, that's about it for this episode. Hopefully, I inspired some thought out there. And of course, feel free to like and subscribe and maybe leave a review. Tell me what your thoughts are. And I'm sure I will be looking at other ideas that have shaped modern philosophy, politics, and culture, in addition to doing movie reviews of all different types and TV show episode reviews. Recently, I even did a local restaurant review for some reason. I don't know why, I just kind of felt like it, I guess. But, I'd cover all sorts of topics. And eventually, I'm even going to be watching and reviewing some smut films at some point. So, it could be horror movies, it could be philosophy, it could be this, it could be that. This is really a podcast that's about all sorts of different things. So, even though in this episode I talk about things that might make certain feminists happy, there might be some episodes down the line where I'll highlight some differences or express views that feminists wouldn't like me to express. It's one of those things where you don't have to necessarily agree with every feminist out there in order to you know still be basically a feminist or whatever. Like, I believe in equality between the sexes and different genders out there, and I see no reason of why I have to sort of self censor if I have a disagreement with an individual claim made by somebody under the broad feminist umbrella. So, like, one of the basic differences might be, like, should people be able to call women chicks or something like that? Like, well, I personally have no problem with the term chick. That's just that's just one example. Um, and of course, there are certainly others, but that's like a pretty common one. So anyway, have a good day. Hopefully, this provided you food for thought.